this is the thing that's important for the West to understand, and for Ukraine to understand. The longer they take to accept the latest Russian terms, the worse those terms are going to get as this war progresses. If you go back to 2022, Ukraine actually had very favorable terms that Russia presented. If you go back to Minsk II and Minsk I, they weren't even talking about Donetsk and Lugansk as separate oblasts, republics. So the more this goes along, the worse the terms get. So the EU, entry into the EU has not been specifically stated in those June 2024 terms, but you're getting a lot of statements from very high-level Russian officials who are now saying, you know what? NATO and the EU are no different. So our terms on the table right now are saying no NATO, but we have these EU guys running around, which is true. You have a lot of EU officials running around and saying there's no difference between NATO and the EU, or one and the same. And so the Russians are now viewing this as, well, you know, if we let them into the EU, it's pretty much giving them one foot in the door to NATO. So this is the point, is that they need to act quickly. And I think Trump has finally understood this, talking to Putin. And I think there are people who are advising Trump. There are bad people who are advising Trump. I think he has some good people advising him who are telling him, look, this may not be the optimal outcome. This may not be what the Biden administration was aiming for. This may not be the best situation for the United States or for Europe or for NATO. But if this attrition continues, the next deal is going to be much worse. The next deal, we'll be talking about Odessa. We'll be talking about Kharkiv. We'll be talking about Russia on the Dnieper.
That would be heartbreaking. Like, I've been to Kharkiv so many times. That'd be crazy.
Yeah, this is the thing. But, you know, when you go back to 2022, before Boris Johnson flew to Kiev and scuttled that deal, Ukraine had a very good deal on the table. And then when you go back to Minsk I and Minsk II, they had a deal that they would jump on today.
Yeah, I know. How much do you blame Ukraine versus NATO? Because I feel like Ukraine's kind of and feel free to disagree with me at any time, but I feel Ukraine was just a pawn in NATO's expansion. And they end up being the biggest loser. And the most courageous party in this entire
I completely agree with you. But you know, the leadership of Ukraine, they decided to go along with this. You know, it's interesting. The point that you make is interesting because, once again, when you go to, I mean, first of all, Zelensky ran as a peace president. Okay, he was elected on the promise that he would institute he would implement the Minsk agreements, and that things would settle down in the Donbass. So that's what he ran on, and that's what he won on. And when you look at the voting patterns, it showed that even the Russian speakers and the ethnic Russians, they were supporting Zelensky, because Zelensky was telling them, we're going to settle this in a peaceful way. We're going to implement Minsk. We're going to have good relations with the West. We're going to have good relations with Russia. We're going to act as a type of bridge, which was the right message. That was the right strategy. But then when he got into office, you know, things changed. And I think you're right. I think, you know, NATO, the Biden administration, they had a different agenda. The European Union, they had different plans.
Weaken Russia.
And even weaken Russia, provoke a war, get a regime change. That was their goal. We have to get a regime change in Russia.
Yeah. But then, okay, so I've got just so many things to mention. So first, just for the audience that is not too deep, in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, and they had about 30 to 40% of Luhansk and Donetsk, which is kind of a territory that's shared on the border between Ukraine and Russia. After 2022, they kind of encircled, when the invasion happened, they encircled Ukraine from the north and the east, and they, you know, managed to claim a lot of territory. Ukraine successfully pushed them back, especially in the north. And then where we're at today is the Donetsk region. About 70% of it, over 70%, is controlled by Russia. Then you got the Zaporizhia region, which is just below it, about the same, controlled by Russia. Kherson, a bit below, again about the same, but the main cities, the capital cities of those two oblasts, those two regions, are still controlled by Ukraine. And then Crimea is under full Russian control. And it's kind of created a bridge between Donetsk, which is almost all under Russian control, and Crimea. They're all controlled by a kind of a land bridge that is Zaporizhia and Kherson. Now, what the demand is from Russia, which is pretty clear, and most people agree, that Russia would like Ukraine to pull out of Donetsk, the 30% they still have in Donetsk, and Zaporizhia and Kherson. Ukraine is saying they cannot pull out because these are very important defensive positions, and pulling out will allow Russia to go deeper into Ukraine, which we'll get into a bit further. I want to go back and just kind of giving context for the audience that's not too deep into this. I want to go back to the discussion about whether Russia or Putin looked at this as a war of attrition from the get-go. Now, I'm not sure if that's what you said or whether his perspective changed after the invasion, because when I interviewed President Lukashenko, and one of the things he said, there's two fascinating things he said in that interview, one of my favorite interviews. One of them, he talked about the mutiny, Prigozhin's mutiny, and how Prigozhin stopped his march towards Moscow because Lukashenko threatened that he'll send Belarusian troops to support Putin, and that was the main reason that Prigozhin stopped the advancement. Separate point, but the second point he mentioned is that he said that Putin, something he does not say often, as you say something that contradicts Putin, but he said Putin did not get into this war expecting a war of attrition or long war. He thought it would be a quick war, looking for a to be able to assert his demands onto Ukraine and potentially lead to a regime change. But then he was surprised by, Ukraine's success and NATO's support to Ukraine, and that kind of became a war of attrition that Putin did not want to be part of. And that's also reinforced in the Istanbul peace agreement in 2022, where Putin put out an agreement. It was almost reached with the Ukrainians, but then obviously Boris Johnson flew in and the agreement fell apart, which shows Putin's initial intention of ending the war quickly, but then over time that shifted to war of attrition because that worked in his favor. He was gaining territory, and he was, this fair bit of support in Russia for the war, a lot more than Ukraine. Would you agree with that analysis that it started off as a quick invasion and then it became a war of attrition that's working in Russia's favor?
Yeah, spot on. Spot on. I would completely agree with that. I would actually add that that when the war started, what Russia wanted to do was to get Kiev, to get Ukraine to the table, because no one was listening to Russia. You got to remember, if you go back to that time period, even the Biden White House was ignoring Russia. They were ignoring Russia's, I don't want to say demands, but Russia's overtures to deal with the security issue in Europe as a whole. Not only Ukraine, but to deal with the security Europe in issue, and to deal with the security issue in Europe, but to also take Russia's interest into consideration. In 2021, Lavrov, he spoke with Blinken multiple times, and he would tell Blinken, look, we need to sit down and we need to get to some sort of an understanding with Ukraine, but also with Europe as well, so that a war doesn't break out. And Russia actually sent many documents. This is documented. They said many documents, many agreements to the United States in order to deal with the issues in Ukraine and in Europe. And you want to know what response they got from Biden? Zero. Biden didn't even respond to the Russian overtures, to the Russian documents, to the Russian letters. They completely froze them out. So you got to go back to even 2021 and understand that the Russians were trying to speak to the Biden White House, but the Biden White House was freezing them out. So eventually you end up with the Munich Security Conference, and this is key in understanding what's going on. So actually, I even back up even more. There was a documented conversation between Lavrov and Blinken, where Blinken told Lavrov, we are going to put missiles in Ukraine. We'll do whatever we want in Ukraine. It's going to get into NATO. NATO is the pathway for Ukraine. If it means that we want to put missiles in Ukraine, short, medium, long range, whatever, we're going to put them in Ukraine. And this was very alarming to the Russians, because this is, once again, you're talking about Russia's red lines, right? There's no way.
Like China, just a simple one, for anyone who disagrees with this, is like China putting missiles, best example, putting missiles in Mexico. Mexico has the right to do whatever they want in Russia. They're a sovereign country, but the US is not going to accept that. Panama Canal being an obvious example of something a lot more, a lot less extreme. Where the US,
I mean, you hear the argument of, they're a sovereign country, they can enter any alliance they want, they could put whatever military there. It doesn't work like that.
Cuba,
yes, they're sovereign. Yeah, exactly. They're a sovereign country. Yes, they can have partnership agreements, they can trade, they can do all these things, but you always have to take into consideration your surroundings, right? I mean, there are regional hegemons, there are global hegemons. You have to take those into consideration when you're dealing in geopolitics and foreign policy. So
why is it? I know everyone likes to say like the military-industrial complex, but how do you think that works in the back end? Because whenever I do these interviews, I try to understand, like, even when I spoke to Lavrov, he doesn't say much. He's a lot more, he's an expert at kind of saying what's right at the right time, unlike Lukashenko, who's a lot more open. But I always, whenever I speak to them, I'm trying to understand like what's happening behind the scenes. Like, for example, in the Minsk room, who made that decision? Who pressured Zelensky in Istanbul? And why? What was their intention behind it? Did they really think that Russia will fold and NATO will expand to Ukraine successfully and expand their influence? Or they wanted an actual war, which I hope is not the case?
No, they thought that Russia was going to fall. And you know how I believe that. And the reason I believe that is because they planned out all the sanctions way ahead of time. Ursula von der Leyen was in the United States in October and November of 2021. And she's on record saying this, that she was in the United States and she was working with the Biden administration planning out the sanctions policy to put against Russia in the situation, in the scenario that there was going to be a war, if there was going to be a war. So they had everything coordinated. So the reason for the sanctions, that sanction rollout that we saw, which was very fast, which was very, very extensive, was to devastate the Russian economy. Because the problem that the United States has, and that a lot of the collective West has, is they don't have an understanding of Russia. They had a much better understanding of Russia, say 30, 40 years ago. Today's Russia experts in the think tanks and the NGOs that claim that they're Russia experts really have no understanding of Russia or the Russian economy or the Russian people or even the Russian war machine. They have zero understanding of the country and its capabilities, and they still hold on to the belief that Russia is just a gas station masquerading as a country. They still hold on to that John McCain belief, which is a fallacy, which is completely wrong. But if you believe that, if you work from that premise, from that core belief, which has it's almost become ingrained in DC thinking, right? DC thinking is now, we place sanctions, countries crumble, we get regime changes. Russia's a gas station masquerading as a country. We'll place all of these sanctions on Russia. The people will rebel. The economy will collapse. We'll get the regime change. And they had this worked out in 2021. It didn't work out like that. The Russian economy has proven to be much more resilient, much more diversified than anyone had expected, and it's actually weathered the sanctions off quite well.
Do you really think that the US and NATO want a regime change or wanted a regime change in Russia? Because it's makes logical sense to me. It's obviously a strategy that the US has done time and time again around the world, but at the same time, there's people like Prigozhin. Putin is not seen as a hardliner in Russia. There's people a lot worse than him, a lot more anti-NATO, anti-US. And when Prigozhin was approaching Moscow, again, according to President Lukashenko, I think it was a CIA were supporting Lukashenko and ensuring Prigozhin did not, succeed in the mutiny. So I'm sure people in NATO would think like, all right, we want a regime change, but what are the risks? Russia's got more nuclear weapons than we do, and one of the strongest militaries in the world. This is not a small country that we're playing with. This is not Bangladesh that we're dealing with. Do you really think they would like a regime change? Or do you still think they do today?
Yeah. Look, I think the U.S. government is big. I mean, the U.S. government is big. It's extensive. It has a lot of different factions. I'm certain there are a lot of factions, a lot of parts of the U.S. government that are thinking the way you're thinking. We don't want a regime change. This is a big country. It's a nuclear power. Putin, when you break Putin down, when you get to the man himself, he's pretty much a moderate, especially when you look at a lot of the people around him. So I'm positive that there are a lot of people in the U.S. government that are saying this is the wrong way to go. But the dominating force when it comes to foreign policy in the United States are the neocons. They are the war hawks. They are people like Lindsey Graham. They are people like Blumenthal and Murphy and all of these people who absolutely want a regime change. Absolutely are pushing for a regime change. People like Newland, people like Blinken and Sullivan, and people like Biden. People need to remember, Biden was a neocon. He was a neocon. He wasn't a liberal. He wasn't a Democrat in the stylings of Kennedy or something like that. He was a war hawk neocon. There was never a war that Biden did not support and didn't like. Going all the way back to Yugoslavia, Serbia, Biden was pushing all of those wars. And we can discuss Clinton and Albright and all of these people. So the dominant faction in the United States, unfortunately, is the war faction. And their view of the world is US domination above everything else. We are the exceptional country. If we're exceptional, then what does that make everybody else? And so these people, they call the shots. They always win out. When you have to make the decisions about which direction you're going to go, if you're in the United States, they're always taking the neocon direction. And the neocon direction is regime change. It's more war. It's escalation. They completely misunderstood Russia and the way Russia works on multiple levels. And now they've lost. And they don't know how to deal with this. And their answer to deal with this is more escalation. If you listen to Lindsey Graham, what's his answer? We need 500% sanctions on China and India, which is what the secondary sanctions are, right? I mean, that's what he's saying. 500% tariffs, sanctions, tariffs, call whatever you want, on China and India. Because why? Why is he saying this, though? Because he thinks in his mind, in his brain, he thinks that the Russian economy is 100% dependent on oil. And if you cut off the countries that are buying Russian oil, then you completely cut off Russia's revenue. That's not Russia's economy. Russia's economy is much more diversified, number one. And number two, you're not going to get these countries to cut off their purchase of oil. You can't go to India and China and tell them, order them to stop buying Russian oil. It's not going to happen. And they've said as much. You're not going to tell us who to buy oil from. So I mean, they have a warped thinking of the way the world works. And they don't know how to deal with this military defeat that is coming their way. Putin offered Trump an off-ramp, and Trump needs to take that off-ramp. And that off-ramp is the June 2024 Istanbul Plus root causes terms. And I think Trump can change his mind. I don't know, but I think Trump has understood that this is the best deal we're going to get. So we should take it.
What do you think of Putin's comment in 2017? He said, I have met with 3 US presidents. They all had their own ideas, but the decisions were made by men in dark suits. How much influence or how much decision-making powers does Trump have in all this? And how much credence do you give that comment? Like, it goes back to the whole military-industrial complex. Who is really making the shots?
Yeah. I think that's a really good question. Very relevant, because during that meeting in the White House, there was a hot mic moment that they caught. And
With
Trump was
Macron.
telling, I don't know who he was talking to be honest, but he was talking to someone, one of the European leaders, I assume.
Yeah.
And he said, I think Putin wants to make a deal with me. He wants to make a deal because it's me. And he said, I think it's crazy, call it crazy, but I really think I get the sense he wants to make a deal because of me. You know that, one part of it is Trump's ego, right? Trump's ego saying he wants to make a deal with me. I'm the peacemaker. I'm going to get the Nobel Peace Prize, all of that stuff. But there's a lot of honesty in that statement. And I think it